Nobody warns you that the person you love most can also be the one holding a door shut behind them. I didn't find that out all at once. It came in small pieces I kept talking myself out of noticing, because I was 34 years old, genuinely happy for the first time in years, and I didn't want to look too closely at the one room in her life she wouldn't let me into. Her name was Claire. For 16 months, I thought I knew everything about her that mattered. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Marcus Webb. I run a landscape architecture firm out of Asheville, North Carolina. Small, but steady. The kind of business my father built with his hands before I inherited it and modernized it just enough to keep it alive. I grew up 40 minutes outside the city, in the kind of family where Sunday supper wasn't optional and my grandmother's cornbread recipe was treated like classified information. Stick with me on this one. It's going to take a while to get where it's going, but that's the only way this story actually makes sense. If stories about families and the things people hide inside them are your thing, you're in the right place. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and go ahead and subscribe. You'll want to catch the next one too. I met Claire at a fundraiser for the botanical garden my firm had done pro bono work for. She was there representing a marketing agency, wearing a green dress and an easy, unhurried confidence that made the whole room feel a little more interesting the second she walked into it. She asked me actual questions about drought-resistant landscaping, which is not a sentence I ever expected to type, and somehow made it sound fascinating instead of exhausting. She laughed at my cousin Dale's terrible joke about mulch within 5 minutes of meeting him at a family barbecue 2 weeks later, and then turned to my mother and asked, genuinely, not politely, about the recipe for the peach cobbler she'd just eaten. My mother grabbed her by the elbow and talked her ear off for the better part of an hour. I stood there watching it happen and thought, so this is how it happens. We dated for 16 months. She met my family early. By month 3, she had a standing seat at my mother's table and knew, without being told, that you never, under any circumstances, sat in my grandfather's old recliner. By month 5, she'd learned which of my aunts to ask about her garden and which ones to steer conversations away from politics with. My family absorbed her completely, the way families do with people they recognize as one of their own before anyone said it out loud. The one place the warmth didn't extend was backward, toward her own family. We're not close, she told me about 2 months in, sitting on her back porch with a glass of wine going warm in her hand. It's complicated. My dad and I had a falling out a long time ago, and it's easier for everyone if we just leave it where it is. They coming to the wedding, if we get there? I asked, half joking. She didn't laugh. If we get there, no? I need you to be okay with that. I told her I was okay with it. And for a long time, I was, because she never gave me a reason to think there was more underneath it than an old, ordinary family wound. People have those. My own family isn't spotless either. My father and his brother didn't speak for the better part of a decade over a disagreement about the family business that, looking back, neither of them can fully explain anymore. Families fracture. That's not a red flag on its own. That's just what happens to people who've known each other long enough to actually hurt one another. What I didn't fully account for was time. 16 months of "we're not close" starts to develop its own kind of gravity. It stops being a fact about her past and starts becoming a shape in our present, a locked door in a house we otherwise lived in completely together, one I walked past every day without really looking at it. I proposed on the deck of a mountain overlook outside town, the whole valley lit gold with late September light. She said yes before I finished the sentence. My mother cried on the phone. My father said, "Good. Now bring her to every Sunday supper so your grandmother can properly fatten her up." My cousin Dale already somehow knew, the way Dale always somehow knows everything before anyone tells him. I was happy, genuinely, completely happy, and I had absolutely no idea what was waiting behind that locked door, or how close I'd come to walking down an aisle without ever once looking. It came to a head on a Sunday evening in early spring at my parents' house, over a table my mother had spent all Saturday preparing. Pot roast, the real version, the one that takes half a day and fills the whole house with the smell of it hours before dinner. Me, Claire, my parents, my grandmother, my cousin Dale and his wife. Everything warm and ordinary until my grandmother, 83 years old and constitutionally incapable of letting an unasked question sit quietly on the table, set down her fork and looked at Claire. "Claire, honey, I've got to ask you something." Claire smiled. "Sure, Miss Ruth. Where are your people?" The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when somebody finally says the thing everyone's been carefully not saying for months. Claire's smile stayed exactly in place, but her eyes shifted just barely. "My dad and I aren't really in contact, Miss Ruth. I've mentioned that." "You mentioned it," my grandmother said. "I'm asking about it." She wasn't being unkind. She was being my grandmother, which in our family means roughly the same thing as unfiltered. Because in this family, you don't marry somebody without at least knowing where they come from. Doesn't mean you have to like it. Just means you ought to know it. "Ruth," my father said, low, one word, the family equivalent of a yellow caution light. My grandmother picked her fork back up, but the question was already sitting in the middle of the table, and no amount of pot roast was going to bury it. Later, after Claire had gone home, my father found me in the kitchen doing dishes. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and leaned against the counter, watching me for a while before he said anything. "She's a good woman," he said. "Not a question. She is. I believe you." He turned his glass slowly. "But son, we're going to stand up in a church. We're going to make promises in front of God and everybody we know, and we're going to do it without ever having laid eyes on a single person from her side of things. You understand what I'm saying isn't about her character. It's about the shape of the thing." "I hear you. Toxic people still exist somewhere," he said. "They've still got an address." He looked at me steadily. "I'm not asking you to go fix anything, Marcus. I'm asking you to know what you're actually walking into before you walk into it." I didn't say anything. He patted my shoulder once and went back to the living room, and I stood in that kitchen a long time with my hands in dishwater gone cold, turning his words over. "Here's what I need you to understand, though. I still wasn't suspicious of Claire, not really. If anything, I was worried about myself. Claire moved in a world of marketing conferences and downtown apartments and friends with graduate degrees and specific opinions about coffee. My own hands had calluses on them from 20 years of actual dirt. The thought that kept surfacing on the drive home wasn't something's wrong with her story. It was, what if her family takes one look at me and decides I'm not what they pictured for their daughter? That fear, small and embarrassing as it sounds now, is the one that eventually sent me looking. Not suspicion. Insecurity dressed up as due diligence. Finding Claire's family didn't take a private investigator. It took a moving company invoice. We were combining households ahead of the wedding, and the moving company needed a copy of Claire's old lease to confirm a security deposit transfer. I was handling the paperwork that week. She was slammed at work, and buried in the file was an old rental application from years earlier, the kind that lists emergency contacts. Under emergency contact, in a section she'd clearly forgotten was even part of the document anymore, was a name, Harold Doyle. Relationship, father. An address in a small town called Fallbrook, about 2 hours east. Not Claire Doyle, Claire Ashwood. The last name I'd known her by the entire relationship, the name printed on our save the dates, the name on the invitations already stacked in boxes in our hallway closet. I sat there staring at that page for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. Somewhere along the way, my fiancée had quietly stopped being a Doyle and started being an Ashwood, and in 16 months, she had never once mentioned that transition to me. I told myself there were 100 boring explanations. A stepfather's name, a professional rebrand for networking reasons, something administrative and unremarkable. I told myself that right up until the Saturday morning, I found myself driving east on Highway 74 with no real plan beyond needing to see the shape of the thing with my own eyes. Fallbrook turned out to be a small town built around a single main street, a hardware store, a diner, a church with a hand-painted sign out front announcing a fish fry 2 Saturdays out. Harold Doyle's address led me to a modest brick house with a wraparound porch, a garden out front gone slightly wild with the end of the season, and a wheelchair ramp built along one side of the front steps that looked recently, carefully installed by someone who'd measured twice. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes before I got out, rehearsing introductions in my head, bracing for a version of intimidating I still, At that point, fully expected to meet. The man who answered the door was in his late 60s, gray-bearded, moving carefully with a cane in one hand. When I told him my name and said I was engaged to his daughter, he went very still, one hand tightening on the doorframe until his knuckles went pale. "Claire," he said, like he was testing whether the words still worked in his mouth after a long time out of use. "You're marrying Claire." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a long moment. And then he did something I wasn't prepared for at all. He stepped back from the door and said, simply, "You'd better come in. There's someone else you should probably meet, too." Inside, the house was worn but cared for, full of photographs. Claire as a child on that same porch, missing her front teeth and grinning anyway. Claire in a graduation gown, Harold's arm around her, a woman I didn't recognize on her other side, beaming so hard it looked like it might hurt. Claire at maybe 16, laughing at something off camera, a version of her I'd never once seen, because the woman in these photographs still belonged fully to this house, and the woman I knew had left most of her here on purpose. In the kitchen, at a small table set for two, a woman about Claire's age, in nursing scrubs, looked up when we came in and went pale. "This is Renee," Harold said quietly. "Claire's older sister." I hadn't known Claire had a sister. 16 months, and I hadn't known that basic fact about the woman I was going to marry. What came out over the next 2 hours, over coffee I didn't ask for and a plate of shortbread cookies Renee put out with visibly shaking hands, was not the story I'd braced myself for. There was no cruelty in it. No controlling father. No version of toxic that matched anything Claire had ever described to me. What there was harder to hear in a different way, quieter, sadder, and far more ordinary than a villain. 8 years earlier, their mother, Harold's wife, a woman named Dorothy, had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. Renee, then 29, had put her own nursing career on pause almost immediately to help manage the caregiving, moving back into the house on Maple Street to be closer. Claire, 26 at the time and just starting to build the marketing career and the downtown life she wanted in Asheville, had been asked, gently, Renee was careful to stress, never as an ultimatum, if she could help with time when she was able. Weekend visits. Presents. The ordinary, unglamorous, exhausting work of showing up for a parent who is disappearing slowly in front of you, one small motor function at a time. She came twice, Renee said quietly, turning her coffee cup in slow circles without drinking from it. The first year. After that, the visits got shorter, then further apart, then they mostly stopped altogether. She told me once it was too hard to watch Mom struggle to hold a fork. I understood that, at first. It is hard. She looked up at me directly. But hard isn't a reason to disappear, Marcus. Hard is exactly the reason you're supposed to stay. Harold's version was gentler, sadder, the version of a man who had spent a long time trying not to be bitter about something that would have entitled him to it. I never asked her for anything she didn't already want to give, he said, turning his cane slowly between his hands. But when your mother got sick, and Claire's calls got shorter, and then stopped altogether, and I eventually found out through a mutual friend from her old high school that she'd started going by her middle name professionally. Ashwood was your grandmother's maiden name, not some family name any of us would have thought to look for. I understood I wasn't ever going to get an actual explanation. Just a door closing, slowly, one silence at a time, until one day there just wasn't a door there anymore. Just a wall where a door used to be. Dorothy Doyle, I learned, had passed away 11 months earlier. Claire had not come to the funeral. She had sent flowers under a name the florist had to look up twice, because it wasn't a name anyone in that house recognized as belonging to family. Renee still had the delivery slip. She showed it to me, not unkindly, just factually, the way you'd show someone a piece of evidence they needed to actually see rather than just be told about. I sat in that kitchen and thought about every wedding conversation Claire and I had ever had about her family being complicated, and understood, for the first time, exactly how much quiet, careful work that one word had been doing on her behalf for a very long time. While I was sitting in that kitchen, my phone buzzed. A text from Claire. "Hey babe, good news. Actually reached out to my dad this week, and we talked. He's doing okay. Might be open to meeting you sometime, before the wedding after all. Feels like a weight off. Love you. I read it twice, sitting 3 feet from the man in question, who had no idea his daughter was, at that exact moment, constructing a version of their relationship that did not exist anywhere except inside a text message sent from a car in a Fallbrook parking lot, presumably, or a downtown Asheville office building, to a fiancé she believed was somewhere else entirely. I didn't say anything to Harold or Renee about it that day. I want to be honest about why. I didn't yet fully understand what I was looking at, and some instinct told me not to react until I did. I drove home to Asheville that afternoon, turning that text over and over in my head. The specific phrase, might be open to meeting you sometime before the wedding, landing very differently now that I'd met the actual man behind that sentence, sitting in his own kitchen, having no idea he'd been mentioned at all, let alone cast as a reformed character in a reconciliation that hadn't happened. That night, I did what I do when I'm trying to make sense of something complicated at work. I built a timeline instead of jumping straight to a confrontation. What I knew: Claire had a father and a sister, both alive, both estranged not through cruelty on their end, but through her own long, quiet withdrawal during her mother's illness. She had rebranded professionally under a name that made her genuinely harder for anyone from that life to trace. She had missed her own mother's funeral, and she was, at this very moment, telling me, and possibly others, a story about a reconciliation that had not actually happened, to someone, for some reason I didn't yet understand. The question that kept me up that night wasn't whether she was lying. That part, unfortunately, was no longer in doubt. It was, what was the lie for? A story like that doesn't get built for no reason, and it doesn't get built for one person's benefit alone. It gets built because there's a room somewhere it needs to open a door into. I just didn't know yet which room. Over the following 2 weeks, I paid attention differently. Not suspiciously, exactly, just carefully. The way you listen to a conversation once you understand it's been happening on 2 levels at once, and you've only been hearing one of them. I noticed a name coming up more than it used to. Diane Castellano, a senior partner at Claire's marketing agency, mentioned warmly, mentioned often, mentioned with a specific frequency that I now recognize as someone being slowly, deliberately introduced into a story before they're actually needed in it. Diane thinks the Kessler account's going to close early. Diane was at the same conference last spring. Diane's been so generous with her time lately. Small mentions, nothing alarming on their own. The kind of thing you drop into casual conversation when you're trying to make somebody feel familiar to a person before that name becomes suddenly, structurally important. I looked Diane up from my office one evening with the door closed. 61 years old, well regarded in the Asheville business community, recently widowed. Her husband had passed the previous winter, no children of her own. Her photograph on the agency website showed a woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of composed, gracious expression that comes from decades of never having to fight for a seat at any table she walked into. Exactly, I understood slowly. The kind of woman who might be flattered rather than suspicious if a junior colleague she liked began treating her, warmly and gradually, like the family she'd recently lost half of. I sat with that for a few days before anything was confirmed. Then, 3 weeks after Fallbrook, Claire told me, genuinely glowing, genuinely moved, in a way that made my chest hurt because some part of her clearly believed every word of what she was saying, that Diane had generously offered to stand in for the father of the bride portions of the wedding, since Claire's own father wasn't up to the trip, health-wise. Health-wise, Harold Doyle used a cane. He was not, as far as I could tell from 2 hours in his kitchen, remotely incapable of a 2-hour drive to Asheville. That detail told me more than almost anything else in the whole story, that Claire wasn't improvising anymore. She was building in contingencies, preloading excuses for questions she anticipated. Diane, it turned out later, had been told a story too, one about a distant, difficult family situation, an absent and largely incapacitated father, a talented young colleague who deserved someone solid in her corner on the biggest day of her life. Diane wasn't part of a lie she understood herself to be part of. She was, as far as I could tell, A genuinely kind woman who'd been handed a role in a play without ever being told there was a script, let alone that she was standing in someone else's family's actual chairs. I called my own father that week and told him everything. Fallbrook, Harold, Renee, the mother who'd passed without Claire at the funeral, the text about a reconciliation that never happened, Diane Castellano being quietly positioned as a stand-in family member for the wedding. My father listened without interrupting once, the way he does when something actually matters, sitting across from me at his own kitchen table with his hands folded, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he said finally. 3 words. No lecture. No "I told you so." Even though he'd all but predicted this exact shape of trouble months earlier over dishwater and bourbon. "I need everyone in the same room," I said. "Before the wedding, not after. Harold and Renee too, if they're willing to come. I don't want a public spectacle for its own sake. I just want the real people to actually be present before we stand up in a church and make promises we don't fully understand yet." He nodded slowly. "The rehearsal dinner, then. The rehearsal dinner." He was quiet a moment longer. "And Diane." "I don't think Diane did anything wrong," I said. "I think she got lied to just like I did. I want her there too. She deserves to know what she actually agreed to be part of, and she deserves to hear it from somewhere other than a scene in front of everyone." My father nodded again, slower this time, and said the same thing he always says when a plan is sound and doesn't need improving. "All right, I'll talk to your mother about the restaurant." My mother's reaction, when she heard the full version later that evening, was considerably less contained. She'd apparently been in the next room the entire time, which in our family isn't considered eavesdropping so much as simply being present. She came into the kitchen with her arms crossed and an expression I can only describe as the specific fury of a woman who has fed someone pot roast in her own home and been quietly lied to in return. She sat at my table. "Marcus," my mother said. She ate my cobbler. And her own mother is in the ground, and her father's sitting alone in Fallbrook wondering what he did wrong. She looked at me for a long moment, then walked over and put both hands on my face, the exact gesture she's been making since I was 4 years old, and she wanted my full attention. "You're going to fix this," she said. "Not a question. Not just for you. For them." I drove back to Fallbrook the following Monday. I called ahead this time, sitting in the driveway before I knocked, and Harold opened the door before I'd even finished the second knock, like he'd been standing near it. We sat again at the same kitchen table, the same coffee, Renee joining us this time from her shift a little later than planned. I told them everything. The rehearsal dinner I was arranging, Diane Castellano's unwitting role in it, my intention to bring the truth into a room where Claire could no longer manage which version of it everyone was allowed to see. Renee's hands went still around her mug. "Marcus, we don't want to make a scene. I understand that," I said, looking at her directly. "But my mother is going to stand at the back of a church and welcome whoever walks through those doors into this family. She deserves to know who that actually is. And you." I looked between them both. "You've spent the last 2 years watching birthday cards and phone calls go unanswered. You deserve to be in the room. Not for drama. Just because somebody, finally, needs to say the true thing out loud, in front of the people it actually concerns." Harold reached over and covered Renee's hand with his own, the two of them quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at me. "What time should we be there?" The week before the dinner moved with a strange, careful precision. My father handled the restaurant personally, a place just outside Asheville my mother chose because it felt like somebody's actual dining room instead of a stage, warm lighting, a private room in the back with a long table and simple linen. My grandmother's contribution to the planning was characteristically direct. "I want to say something to that girl at the door," she informed me over the phone, her voice sharp with the specific outrage of an 83-year-old who had asked exactly the right question months earlier and been proven right. "No, Grandma Ruth," I said. "Not one word until I stand up. I need you to do the hardest thing you've ever done in your whole life." There was a long pause. "Fine," she said finally, with the air of a woman conceding a great deal. "But I want the good cornbread before anybody else sits down, and I'm holding the door on the way out." "Deal," I said, and I meant it completely. My mother handled the menu herself and added, without telling me until the day of, a small framed photograph of my grandfather to the welcome table near the entrance, because, she said simply, he should be there too, in whatever way he still could be. Harold and Renee drove down from Fallbrook on the Saturday morning, checking into a hotel nearby. Harold called me the night before to confirm the details, his voice steady, careful, and at the very end of the call, after we'd gone over logistics twice, he said quietly, "Marcus, whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for driving out to Fallbrook that first day, for knocking on that door instead of just letting it stay closed." A pause. She picked a good one. I don't think she knows that yet, but she did. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told him I'd see him tomorrow. I pressed my one good suit that night and got into bed beside Claire, who was already asleep, already dreaming, presumably, about whatever version of the next day she'd carefully constructed in her head. A warm dinner, a beaming stand-in mother figure, a fiancé who had no reason to suspect anything at all. I lay awake a long time thinking about a man with a cane and a garden gone wild at the end of the season, a woman in nursing scrubs who'd paused her whole career to hold a family together, and a mother in the ground who'd waited, at the end, for a daughter who never came. Someone had shown up too late for Dorothy Doyle. I was determined that wouldn't happen twice. The private dining room was warm and full by the time everyone arrived. My parents, my grandmother, Dale, and his wife. And at 7 o'clock exactly, Claire, glowing in deep blue, with Diane Castellano on her arm, introduced to my family as the woman who's been like a mother to me these last few years. My mother, who had made an entire second pan of peach cobbler under the honest belief she was meeting an actual family member for the first time, shook Diane's hand with a graciousness that must have cost her something to hold steady. Claire moved through that room like she'd already won whatever this evening was, kissing cheeks, laughing warmly, glancing at me every so often with the particular soft triumph of a woman watching her whole carefully built life align exactly the way she'd planned it. I let her have it. I ate. I laughed at the right moments. I refilled glasses. By every visible measure, I was a relaxed man enjoying a rehearsal dinner. I waited until the plates from the main course had been cleared, until the room had that specific warm lull that comes right before dessert. Then I stood, tapped my glass once, and let the silence settle. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I said, keeping my voice even, the way my father talks when something actually matters. A dinner like this isn't just a nice evening for us. It's a declaration. It's us saying, these are the people who matter, and we don't say that lightly. I looked slowly around the table. "So, I want to make sure tonight, we actually have the right people in this room." I nodded to the restaurant manager near the side door, who'd been briefed an hour earlier. He opened it, and Harold Doyle walked in, leaning on his cane, Renee at his side in a plain green dress that was clearly her best one, chin up, moving with the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided, whatever happened next, she was not going to come apart in public. Claire saw them before a single word was said. I was watching her face. I'd positioned myself specifically to watch it. The color left it fast and complete, a tide going out all at once. Her hand, holding her wine glass, went completely still. I reached over without looking away from her and steadied the glass before it tipped, setting it down gently on the linen. "I went to Fallbrook," I said quietly, not performing for the room, talking only to her. "3 weeks ago, I found your father in a garden gone wild at the end of the season, using a cane he didn't have the last time you actually visited. I met Renee. I found out about your mother. You don't understand what it was like to watch her get sick," Claire said, her voice thin, barely a voice at all. "I don't," I agreed. "I believe that was genuinely, unbearably hard. But hard isn't the same thing as gone, Claire. Your father and sister didn't get to choose the last 8 years. You did. Every single one of those choices was yours." I let that sit a moment. "And while I was sitting in their kitchen, you texted me to tell me you'd reconciled with a man who had no idea we'd even spoken." Her mouth opened, some explanation half forming, and died there. I turned to Diane, whose face had moved through several careful stages of understanding in the last 30 seconds and had landed somewhere close to quiet devastation. "Diane, I know roughly what she told you. That her family was cruel, or largely gone, or too unwell to attend. I believe you agreed to stand in this weekend because you're a genuinely kind woman who was handed a story built specifically to need someone exactly like you in it. Diane didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at Claire and then, slowly, at Harold and Renee standing in the doorway, and something in her expression settled into a grief that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognizing, all at once, the shape of what she'd actually been standing inside of for months. "I'm so sorry," Diane said quietly, to Harold, to Renee, to no one in particular. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Renee said gently. "None of this is on you." I looked back at Claire one final time. There was no exit left in that room to search for, and she knew it. "I don't fully know who I've been engaged to for 16 months, I said. "Not anymore. Not the person who let her own mother die without her in the room, and then built an entire other family out of the silence that left behind." I took the ring from my pocket and set it down on the linen in front of her, not thrown, just placed, quietly, the way you set something down when you've decided you're finally ready to stop carrying it. Then I crossed the room, picked up the small floral centerpiece from our own table, and carried it over to where Renee stood. She took it, and something in her that had been held together carefully for a very long time finally came apart. Not loudly, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from years of accumulated grief, finally, finding somewhere safe to go. Harold reached over and shook my hand, gripping it hard, unable yet to find words for whatever he wanted to say. My father appeared beside me the way he always does exactly when it matters most, and extended his own hand to Harold. "I should have met you a long time ago," my father said simply. "I'm sorry it took this." "Thank you for raising the kind of man who came looking," Harold said, his voice rough. My mother didn't shake Renee's hand. She pulled her into a full embrace, immediate and unconditional, the way my mother holds anyone who clearly needs holding. My grandmother, true to her word, said not one thing to Claire. She simply looked at her for a long moment, shook her head slowly, almost sadly, and turned to help my mother gather coats. We walked out together, my family, Harold, Renee, even Diane, who fell into step beside my mother without either of them needing to discuss it. My mother's arm linked through Renee's. My father and Harold walking side by side with the quiet ease of two men who'd just recognized something in each other. Dale held the door. My grandmother brought up the rear, pausing once at the threshold to look back into the room. I looked back too, just once. Claire was sitting alone at the center of the table, in her deep blue dress, in her perfectly constructed evening, the ring sitting on the linen in front of her, the centerpiece gone from its place. Her friends from the agency, 3 of them she'd invited, part of the carefully curated life she'd built in Asheville, sat frozen in their chairs with the particular discomfort of people who have just witnessed something they cannot unknow and don't have anywhere to put. Nobody went to her. Nobody pulled her aside to offer a version of events that made it easier. Nobody played the part she needed played, because there were no more parts left available. The whole cast had simply walked out the door. Outside, the October air was cool and clean, downtown Asheville moving around us like it had no idea what had just happened inside that restaurant. I stood next to my father and just breathed for a moment. He put his hand on the back of my neck, the same gesture he's used since I was a kid, trying not to cry about something. "Your grandfather would have done the same thing," he said. That was all. That was enough. Across the sidewalk, Harold Doyle was looking up at the sky with Renee tucked under his arm, the white flowers still in her hands, both of them breathing the same cool evening air, like people who'd just been handed something back they'd quietly given up on ever seeing again. Harold caught me looking and nodded once. Not a thank you nod, exactly. Something that didn't quite have a word yet. I nodded back. "If you've been with me a while, you know I like to slow down at the parts that matter instead of rushing past them to the ending. So let me tell you what happened after, because I think it matters more, in the end, than the dinner itself." I drove back to Fallbrook 3 more times over the following 2 months. Not for Claire, not to fix anything with her, but because I'd met 2 people who deserved more than a single dramatic evening followed by silence again. Harold and I talk most weeks now, Mostly about nothing in particular. His garden, a hardware store project, a fish fry he's been threatening to drag me to. Renee and I got coffee a few times, mostly so I could apologize, in my own halting way, for the 8 months I'd unknowingly spent being engaged to the reason her father's Christmases had gotten so quiet. Diane called me about 3 weeks after the dinner. She'd taken some time, she said, to sit with what she'd learned, and she wanted me to know she didn't hold any of it against Harold or Renee, and that she'd reached out to Renee directly to apologize in person, one kindness she felt she genuinely owed. I lost my husband last year, she told me quietly. I think some part of me wanted a family badly enough that I didn't ask enough questions about the one I was being handed. I don't think that makes me foolish. I think it makes me exactly the kind of person somebody in pain will look for. I told her I didn't think she was foolish either. I still believe that. I didn't marry Claire, obviously. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, that she left Asheville a few months later for a city further north, under a name I no longer have any reason to keep track of. I don't know whether she ever went back to Fallbrook, or whether she and Harold and Renee have found their way to anything resembling repair. Some doors, once you've watched someone close them deliberately, from the inside, aren't really yours to worry about reopening on their behalf. What I do know is this. I still visit that brick house with the wraparound porch every couple of months. Harold's garden is doing better this year. Renee says he's out there every morning now, like he's finally got somewhere worth being again. Last time I visited, he told me, almost as an aside, pulling weeds along the front walk in the last of the autumn light, that he thought Dorothy would have liked knowing someone actually knocked on that door eventually, instead of just another silence quietly arriving in its place, the way silences had for 8 straight years. I think about that a great deal. About the difference between the family someone tells you about, carefully, selectively, over 16 months of dinners and holidays, and the family that's actually still standing there, waiting long after everyone else has assumed they've stopped. Thanks for sticking around for this one. If you want more stories like it, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.